The visiting surgeon called her just a clinic nurse, a woman who ran the front of a 6-bed hospital on a working harbor and handed out forms and warm coffee to people waiting their turn, and he laughed at the worn brass diver's gauge she kept clipped to her lanyard. And not one person in that small salt-stained building knew that the quiet woman they had decided was a fixture had once kept the catastrophically wounded alive in a steel room far out at sea while the deck pitched under her and the lights flickered and the dying came down the ladder faster than there were hands, and that before the night was over she would be the only person still moving who could keep their patients from dying on the floor of their own emergency room. Her name was Dana Holloway, and most of the staff called her Dana, and the visiting surgeon, the one who had come up the coast to cover a colleague's elective list and had decided within an hour of arriving that a charge nurse in her early 40s at a harbor hospital was a quaint local fixture and not a colleague, did not really call her anything at all. Because to him she was part of the building, as ordinary as the rows of empty chairs in the waiting room, or the soft hum of the ice machine in the corner, or the gulls crying out over the water beyond the tall glass doors. She was 42 years old. She had been a nurse for 18 of those years, the last 7 at this small critical access hospital that sat on a spit of land between the town and the fuel-and-fertilizer terminal, where the nearest real burn center was an hour and 10 minutes across a single causeway bridge in good traffic and a different planet entirely in bad. Working the long evenings because the evenings were hers and the work was honest and nobody had the energy to tell her how to do a job she had been doing since before half of them had finished their training. She moved through the little hospital the way deep water moves, slow and certain and easy to underestimate, and on the night everything changed, she was exactly where she always was at the start of a shift, at the small front desk under the bright ceiling lights, clipping a worn brass and steel diver's depth gauge on a faded webbing strap to her ID lanyard before she opened the board. The gauge was old. The brass had gone soft and warm at the edges from years of being held, and the glass face was faintly scratched, and clipped beside it on the same loop was a small dull coin, plain metal worn smooth. The kind of thing a person is given and does not buy, though none of the visiting staff had ever looked closely enough to wonder what it was. She checked it the way some people check a watch when they are bracing for a long day, a glance at the little needle that had once told her how deep she was and how much she had left, and then she snapped the lanyard straight and squared her shoulders and went to look at her board. Dr. Vincent Ashford was 53 years old and one of the better elective surgeons in the city 2 hours down the coast, and he had not really wanted to be at this harbor hospital at all. He had come up to cover a friend's list of scheduled, tidy daylight operations for a week, the kind of clean, planned work he had built his whole reputation on, and he had arrived to find a sleepy 6-bed building with a single old imaging machine and paper charts at the front desk and a quiet clinic nurse running the place, and he had filed all of it under the same heading within the hour, which was beneath him. He was not a cruel man, exactly. He was something more ordinary and more dangerous. A skilled man who had spent 26 years being the most important person in every operating room he entered, and had come to believe that the size of the building was the same thing as the size of the people in it, and that a nurse at a 6-bed hospital was, by simple arithmetic, a nurse who had not been good enough to work anywhere that mattered. He looked at a harbor-charged nurse writing in pen under a fluorescent light, with a battered brass dive gauge on a frayed strap around her neck, and he saw a person playing at medicine in a place where medicine barely happened, and he felt, in the easy, weightless way you feel it about someone you have never once imagined being, a flicker of contempt dressed up as professional concern. You know they make watches now that tell you all that, Or there's an app right there on your phone, he said to her an hour into his first evening, with a smile that was almost kind, nodding at the brass gauge on her chest. You don't need to carry your little dive toy around an emergency room, sweetheart. You're not going to get the bends walking to the supply closet. And Dana had looked down at the small brass thing on her lanyard and then back up at him, and she had said, "I know," and nothing else, and gone back to her board, and he had taken her silence for the surrender of a woman who had no answer, when in fact it was the silence of a woman who had a great many answers and had simply learned across 18 years that the people who needed to tell her she was out of her depth were almost never the people who would listen if she told them why she was not. So she let it stand. She let nearly all of it stand. That was the thing about Dana Holloway that one night would teach them all at once. She did not need them to see her. She needed her patience sorted and breathing and her hands steady and the gauge on her chest, though she could not always have told you why she still carried it after all these years, only that the day she stopped would be the day she would need it. If you have ever watched someone good get treated like they were nothing and felt that quiet anger that has nowhere to go, then you already understand why I tell these stories, and you already belong on this channel. Take 1 second to subscribe, because Unspoken Valor exists for exactly that feeling and exactly these people, the ones the room writes off, the ones who turn out to be the only thing holding the room up when it starts to fall. The folks who do are the ones who stay for the part where the world finally finds out who it has been ignoring. And that part is coming, and I do not want you to miss it. Because what happened in that little harbor hospital before the night was through is the kind of thing that, if you had been standing at that front desk, you would never have looked at a quiet clinic nurse the same way again. There were 2 younger members of staff who took their cue from the surgeon the moment he arrived. The way people always defer to the loudest credential in the room, a confident young physician assistant named Reyes and a brisk, quick young nurse named Tully, both in their late 20s, both bright and capable, both good people who had simply been taught by the whole shape of their training to trust the title over the person and the protocol over the quiet woman who could not quote them the year a guideline had changed. They were not bad. That is the part that matters. That the people who fell in behind the surgeon and looked at Dana Holloway with new doubt were not villains. They were just impressionable, in the specific way that smart young people are when a famous expert walks into their small world and tells them, without quite saying it, that everything they had taken for granted was provincial. On most nights, on an ordinary harbor evening where the patients came in 1 or 2 at a time and the problems arrived tidy and slow, none of it cost anything at all. The ward ran. The ice machine hummed its steady hum. The clinic nurse handled the front and was easy to defer past, and everyone was comfortable inside the arrangement, and nobody ever once imagined 100 burned and choking people coming through those doors in a single hour. There was a third figure in the small theater of Dana's working life that week, and he was not even in the building, which somehow made him worse, because a man who can belittle you from 200 miles away through a telephone is a man with a long reach. His name was Roland Pace, and he was 47, and his title was something long and modern that came down, in the end, to numbers. He ran the region's small network of community hospitals from an office in the city, had never once set foot in this one on a working evening, and moved through his work like a man reading a balance sheet that happened to be made of people. He had heard about the charge nurse at the harbor hospital, who ran her own surge drills in the empty ambulance bay at the slow hour of the shift, who had once asked, on a regional call, whether anyone had a real mass casualty plan for the harbor district if the terminal next door ever caught fire, and who had been told, with a small laugh that this was a 6-bed critical access hospital, not a field hospital, and that she should focus on her core metrics. Roland Pace did not find it charming. He found it a liability, because a nurse doing unscripted things in one of his buildings was a variable he could not put in a column, and the columns were the whole of his religion. So he had begun quietly to build a file. He had the drills noted as unauthorized use of clinical space, the longhand cards as a documentation inconsistency, the gauge, in an email, as personal equipment not approved by the supply committee, a phrase he was rather proud of, and he had scheduled a formal conversation for the following week, and that very evening, when the surgeon called the regional line to complain that he was stranded for a week in a building run by a nurse who carried a dive gauge and wrote in pen, Roland Pace had listened with growing satisfaction, because here was a credentialed physician confirming everything his file already said. The write-up itself had come 2 days before, a printed sheet that the nervous junior administrator drove out to the harbor to hand her in person because Roland Pace believed in a paper trail. It was a formal counseling notice, the first of her career, and it cited the drills and the cards and the trinket. And at the bottom there was a line for her to sign acknowledging that she understood. She set the paper down, she reached up without quite deciding to, and her thumb found the small worn coin clipped beside the gauge on her lanyard, and she turned it over once, the way she always did when something was about to make a mistake, and the narration of her own life went very quiet in her chest. That coin was older than Roland Pace's entire career in health administration. It had been pressed into her palm on a steel deck at the end of the worst night of her life by a man with smoke still gray in the creases of his face and other people's blood dried brown to his forearms, who had told her to keep it because people who do what she had just done do not get parades. They get to go home. And the coin is so you remember the ones who did not. The gauge had come from the same man, and she did not say any of that. She looked at the junior administrator's apologetic face and picked up the pen and signed the paper, because she had learned a long time ago that you do not waste your strength arguing with a system that is sure, and you save it for the night the system finds out whether you were right. What none of them knew, what was written in no file in this hospital or in Roland Pace's office or anywhere a credential committee would ever look, was where Dana Holloway had spent the 11 years before she had ever clocked in at a small harbor hospital. She had worn a different uniform and answered to a call sign instead of a name, and she had been a Navy shipboard casualty receiving and surgical nurse, which meant her ward had been a steel compartment deep in a ship far out on the water, and her patients had been the most broken people a bad day at sea or a worse day ashore could produce. Brought down the ladder still bleeding, still burning, still fighting for breath, and handed into her care with the simple, terrible instruction to keep them alive until the ship could get them to a place with more. She had learned out there the thing that no classroom can teach and no protocol can hold, which is how to practice medicine in a box that moves, in the heat and the noise and the smell of burning, with the power stuttering and the deck healing and more dying than there were hands, how to look at a passageway full of the catastrophically wounded and feel the panic rise in her own throat and set it down, deliberately like a tool she could not use right now, and start sorting. She had learned that in a true mass casualty load, the most dangerous instinct a clinician has is the urge to pour everything into the first person they see, because the first person they see is rarely the one who will die in the next 10 minutes. And the whole grim art of it is to move past the loud to reach the silent. She had buried friends who never learned to move past the loud. And then, for reasons she kept folded up small and did not take out at work, she had come ashore for good and traded the call sign for a name tag and taken the quietest, honest job she could find on a working harbor and let everyone assume she had never done anything harder than hand out cough drops and clipboards. There was one person in the building who suspected there was more to her, and his name was Marcus, the night aide, a warm, broad-shouldered man in his 30s with an instinct for reading people that no one had ever put on his evaluation. Marcus had worked beside Dana for 5 years, and in 5 years he had watched 100 small things the visiting doctors never noticed. He had watched her eyes go flat and calm in exactly the moments other people's went wide, watched her voice drop lower and slower when a case turned bad instead of climbing the way panic climbs, watched her hands stay perfectly still over a crashing patient while a brand new traveling nurse's shook. He had watched her glance at the ceiling and the oxygen shutoffs and the exits in any new room, once automatically, the way some people check for the nearest coffee. He had watched her step off distances in the empty ambulance bay on slow nights, her lips moving, mapping where she would put the wounded if the whole drive ever filled at once, and he had never once asked her why, because you did not ask Dana things, you simply noticed that the answers were there, behind the quiet, and that they were not the answers a normal ARSM would explain. Once, a cocky traveling nurse had rolled his eyes at Dana's longhand cards and her gauge and muttered something about the burned-out small-town lifer, and Marcus had taken him aside, very calmly, and told him to leave her be, that the day was coming when he would want to be standing exactly where Dana Holloway was standing, and he had better hope she still bothered to teach him anything by then. The traveling nurse had laughed it off. Marcus had not been joking. The night it happened began like any other, which is the way these nights always begin. It was a Thursday at the tail of summer, and the heat had sat heavy on the harbor all day, the air thick and still and smelling of diesel and salt and the faint chemical sweetness that always came off the terminal when the wind died. The kind of dead flat evening when the gulls went quiet and the water lay like beaten metal and the old hands down on the docks said you could taste the weather turning. The little emergency room had its ordinary slow catalog of harbor trouble. A dock worker with a hand he had crushed in a winch, a woman who had turned an ankle on a slick gangway, a deckhand with a fishhook deep in the meat of his thumb, a feverish line cook from one of the waterfront places, a long-haul driver who had pulled off the causeway with chest pain he had been ignoring since the state line. Dana worked the front of it the way she always did, calm and unhurried and unremarkable to anyone watching, calling them up one at a time, laying 2 fingers on a wrist while she asked the questions, reading 100 small signals the form did not ask for, the color of a lip, the set of a jaw, the particular way a person holds the part of them that is most wrong. She moved the talkative ones to the warm chairs and the quiet gray ones to the back, and twice that evening she moved someone faster than their numbers said she should have, on nothing she could have written down, and twice that evening she was right. The second time, it was the long-haul driver with the chest pain. The triage screen had him as a low priority, walked in on his own. Stable enough vitals, a routine recheck, and Reyes, eager to look decisive in front of the famous surgeon, had already waved him toward a chair to wait. Dana looked at him for the length of one breath and saw something the screen did not see, a faint grayness at the edges of him, a stillness in the way he sat that was not calm, but the opposite of calm, the body going quiet the way a body goes quiet when it is busy with something serious underneath. She did not announce it. She simply walked him back herself into a bay and put him on a monitor, and a few minutes later, the something underneath announced itself in a way no one could miss, a rhythm sliding sideways toward the edge of a cliff, and because she had moved him when she did, There was a team and a crash cart standing around him when it happened, instead of an aide finding him slumped over in a chair an hour later. Ashford arrived in the middle of it, took over with brisk competence, did good work, real work, stabilized the man and got the rhythm back where it belonged, and afterward, when it was done and the driver was alive and resting, Ashford looked at the chart and frowned and said, to no one in particular, that triage had over-prioritized a borderline patient and tied up a bay on a busy evening. Marcus opened his mouth. Dana caught his eye across the bay and gave the smallest shake of her head, and Marcus closed his mouth, and the moment passed, and Ashford walked away certain he had just watched his own skill save a life, which in part he had, never once wondering whose judgment had put the man in front of him alive enough to save. That was how it went, the whole long, slow education the building refused to receive. Dana would see the thing first and move, and someone with letters after their name would arrive in time to finish what her seeing had started and take the win, and file her foresight under provincial fussiness. She did not need the win. She had learned, in the years she did not talk about, exactly how little the credit was worth and exactly how much the work was worth, because she had done the work in places where there was no credit to be had, where you kept alive who you could keep alive and carried the rest in you forever, and no one ever wrote your name down at all. A 6-bed hospital on a quiet harbor on a still summer Thursday was, by comparison, a gentle place. She was grateful for the gentleness. She had earned a little gentleness. She had no way of knowing that the gentleness had exactly 2 hours and 10 minutes left to run. Around 6 in the evening, the air did the thing the old hands had been muttering about, the wind shifting and dying entirely, and a strange flat hush came down over the harbor, and Reyes and Tully were running the back of the little ward with the bright, tireless confidence of people who have a famous surgeon to impress. And Ashford had settled into a chair near the nurse's station with a cup of coffee and the air of a man enduring a delay, glancing now and then at the clinic nurse and the brass gauge with the faint amusement of a tourist. They were all of them good, in their way, and the story is not interested in making fools of them, only in showing the gap between what they knew and what was about to be asked of them. Ashford knew more about the careful planned repair of a human body than anyone for 100 miles. Reyes and Tully knew their algorithms cold, but none of the three of them had ever stood in front of more catastrophe than the building could hold and decided, in the space of seconds and without help, who lived. They did not know that this was a different skill entirely, that it could not be reasoned out from first principles in the moment, that it had to already be in the hands and the spine before the moment arrived, drilled in until it ran without the conscious mind, the way Dana had drilled it into hers in the empty ambulance bay on 100 slow nights, while they would have laughed at her from the doorway. They thought, the way the confident and the credentialed think, that being good at medicine would be enough. They were about to find out that being good at ordinary medicine is never enough, not for this, that for this you need something older and quieter and far more expensive, paid for in a currency none of them had ever been asked to spend. At 9 minutes past 6, 300 yards down the spit of land, inside the fuel-and-fertilizer terminal that crowded right up against the hospital's seaward fence, a pump seal on an aging storage tank failed in the heat, and a fine mist of volatile product found the hot housing of a motor that should have been shut down for maintenance a year before, and the evening came apart. Inside the little emergency room, at first it was only a sound, but it was a sound that arrived in the body before the mind could name it. A deep, flat, enormous whump that they felt in the floor and the teeth and the water glasses on the counter before they heard it. And then the windows on the seaward side flexed, and one of them cracked corner to corner. and the lights swung, and a half-second later the real noise came, the long, rolling roar of it, and an orange light bloomed against the dusk outside the tall glass doors and lit every face in the waiting room the color of a furnace. For one held breath, nobody moved. And then, beyond the glass, a column of black smoke shot with fire began to climb into the flat evening sky over the harbor. And the first car alarm started, and then another, and then the screaming began somewhere out toward the water, and the little hospital on the spit of land understood, all at once and far too late, that the thing the quiet clinic nurse had asked about on a regional call and been laughed at for had just happened 300 yards from its doors. If you've made it this far into Dana's story, hit subscribe, because what happens next is the part I've been waiting to tell you. Because up to now you have seen a competent woman swallow insult after insult and keep her dignity, and that is something, but it is not yet the thing. The thing is what happens in the next 10 minutes. When the doors of that quiet little hospital blow open and the burned and the choking come through faster than anyone can count, and a skilled visiting surgeon and two confident young clinicians who have spent the whole evening certain of everything discover that all of it, the titles and the fellowships and the famous hands, has abandoned them at once. And the only person in the room who knows what to do is the clinic nurse the surgeon wrote off for carrying a dive gauge. There is no way you walk away from this story once you have seen what she does when the wounded start to arrive. Dana understood before any of them. Dana had gone completely still at the front desk the instant the floor jumped, the pen stopped over the card, her head turned a half-degree toward the seaward windows, and something went quiet behind her eyes that Marcus, glancing over, recognized at once and felt the bottom drop out of his stomach to see. Dana had felt a blast move through a steel deck and into her own bones more times than she let herself count, and she knew, the way you know the sea is about to turn, because you can feel it in the soles of your feet, precisely what was coming and precisely how little time they had before it arrived. She did the arithmetic in under a second, the brutal arithmetic she had hoped she would never do again. A tank gone up at the terminal, a second tank beside it, and a third, all of them full, all of them now sitting beside an open fire. Burns, the worst kind, flash burns and contact burns from a fireball that size blast, the lungs and the ears and the hidden ruptures that a blast wave drives through a body and leaves no mark on the outside. And the cloud, the thing she feared most, because that terminal stored more than fuel, it stored agricultural chemicals by the ton, and a fire under those was going to lift a drifting plume of God knew what across a district full of people. And every soul who breathed it was going to come through these doors choking, and some of them were going to bring the poison in on their skin and their clothes and spread it to anyone who touched them. The Causeway Bridge, the one road to the burn center, would jam solid inside minutes with everyone in the harbor district trying to flee across it at once. No helicopter could land near a chemical fire and a second tank threatening to blow. There were going to be more patients through these doors in the next hour than this hospital saw in a year. They were going to arrive contaminated and burned and unable to breathe, and the people staffing it did not yet know they were already losing. She set the pen down. She closed her hand around the worn brass gauge on her lanyard, once the way another person might cross themselves, and felt the small, familiar weight of the scratched glass face under her thumb, the old instrument that had once told her how deep she was and how much air she had left, and she breathed out, slow, and set the fear down where she had learned to set it. The first ones came through the doors a few minutes later, on their own 2 feet, and they set the tone for everything after. A man in his 40s in a scorched dock coat, half his face the wrong color and weeping where the flash had caught it, walking fast and bright and wrong, asking if someone could call the yard office. The particular cheerful dissociation of a man whose mind has not yet caught up with what has happened to his body. Behind him, through the smoke-smeared glass, headlights swung wild as people abandoned cars in the lot, and behind the man, on foot, came the others. 2 and then 5 and then a dozen, staggering and carried and led. A torn, ragged tide of dock workers and harbor residents in singed work clothes and street clothes, with the oily reek of the fire still on them, and a wet, rattling cough already starting in their chests, and the small, bright waiting room filled, in the space of 90 seconds, with more burned skin and noise and raw human fear than it had held in the entire 7 years Dana had worked there. A woman was screaming a man's name over and over. Someone was down near the doors and not moving. The man in the scorched coat sat down suddenly in the middle of the floor, still asking about the yard office, and his bright, wrong talking began to slow, and his lips, Dana saw from across the room, were going the dusky color that means a person is not moving enough air, and worse than that. She could smell it on the whole incoming crowd under the smoke, the sharp chemical bite that told her the cloud had reached them, and that some of these people were carrying it in on their clothes right now into her waiting room. And the little hospital froze, not from cowardice, from the simple human fact that nothing in their experience had prepared them for the shape of it, for the all-at-onceness, for the way a true surge does not arrive as a series of patients, but as a single overwhelming wall. And worse, a wall that was contaminated, that made every instinct to rush in and help into a way to spread the poison further. Reyes came around the corner and stopped dead, a chart still in his hand, his face going pale and slack as his mind tried and failed to find the algorithm for this. Because there is no algorithm for this on the screen assumes one patient and infinite resources, and what stood in front of him was infinite patience and almost no resources at all. Tully went to the nearest person, the man coughing on the floor, and knelt and started doing exactly what she had been trained to do. A careful, thorough assessment, talking to him gently, putting her own bare hands on his contaminated coat without a second thought, and it would have been good care in any other circumstance, and was, at that moment, precisely the wrong thing, because while she gave one talking man her complete attention, she was contaminating herself, and 3 people she had not yet looked at were dying quietly along the wall, and she did not know to move past him, because no one had ever taught her that moving past was the job. And Ashford, the best hands for 100 miles, came up out of his chair and took in the room and felt, for the first time in 26 years, the specific ground-tilting vertigo of a man whose entire expertise has just become irrelevant. Because his expertise was the deep, methodical, planned repair of one body at a time in a controlled room with a full team, and what stood in front of him was not one person, and there was no team and no controlled room. Only a smoke-lit waiting area filling with the burned and the choking and the contaminated, and 6 beds and a clinic nurse, and he opened his mouth to give an order and found he did not have one, and he heard his own voice come out higher than he meant it to, calling for a burn unit that did not exist here, calling for a team that was not coming. And every person in earshot heard the famous man's voice climb, and the fear in the room doubled, because a frightened crowd takes its temperature from the loudest authority, and the loudest authority was coming apart. And into the center of that, while the surgeon's voice climbed and the young ones knelt over the wrong patients with their bare, unprotected hands, walked the clinic nurse, and she was not frozen at all. What the room saw in the seconds after, it would spend the rest of their careers remembering. Dana Holloway stepped up onto a chair at the front of the waiting room, and she used the first tool she had ever been given, the only one that works before any other. Her own voice, raising it but not in panic, in a flat, enormous command that cut clean through the screaming and stopped it. 3 words. The same 3 words she had used in a steel passageway on the worst night of her life. Listen to me. And something in the trained, absolute certainty of it, the complete absence of fear in a room drowning in fear, made every face turn toward her, the wounded and the staff and the surgeon all at once, the way people in a sinking ship turn toward the one calm voice. If you can hear me and you can walk, she said, into the silence she had made, I need you to go back out through those doors, to the right, away from the smoke, and a man will meet you and help you get the chemicals off you, and then you come back in clean and we take care of you. You walk out now, and you get rinsed off, and you have already done the hardest part. And it was not cruelty, it was the opposite of cruelty. The first act of someone who knew that you cannot save anyone in a contaminated room, that the dirty must be made clean before they cross the threshold, or the poison takes the helpers too, and that the only way to find the dying was to clear away everyone who was not yet dying. And the walking wounded, the bright talking ones, rose and moved back toward the doors, and in 20 seconds the crush in the waiting room thinned, and the truly broken were suddenly visible against the floor. And Dana was already stepping down off the chair and turning to Marcus, who alone had not frozen, who was watching her with the look of a man finally seeing a thing he had suspected for 5 years. Marcus, the bay doors, the seaward hose, now, she said, fast and flat and certain. You're decon. Nobody comes through the front. Every single one of them goes through you first. Clothes off, rinsed head to foot, the burns too, cool water, not cold, and you keep the runoff away from the doors. Anybody who's clean and walking, send them to the far end of the lot. Anybody who can't walk, you rinse where they lie and you call me. You do not let one contaminated patient into my department. Can you hold that line? And Marcus, who had wanted for 5 years to be asked to do something that mattered beside this woman, said, I've got it, and went. And within 90 seconds, there was a man at the seaward bay with a hose and a system, turning the chaos at the doors into a single clean funnel, and that one decision, made in the first 3 minutes by a clinic nurse standing on a chair, was the decision that kept the whole hospital from becoming a contaminated casualty itself. The decision not one other person in the building would have known to make. Then she turned to the room, and she began, in a voice that carried without shouting, to build a machine out of the frightened people around her. The first person she reached, once the decon line was running and the clean wounded began to come through, was a young woman laid on the floor by a stranger, conscious, gray, one trouser leg burned away, and the thigh beneath it pumping dark and steady, a spreading stain under her on the tile that told Dana everything before she even knelt. A major bleed, an artery, the kind of wound that empties a person in minutes and that no amount of careful assessment will help if the assessment comes before the bleeding stops. Reyes had drifted over, drawn by the obvious severity, already reaching for a supply cart, already starting the right and far too slow process of finding the things the system told him to find, and Dana did not wait for any of it. She had a folded triangular bandage out of her own hip pocket and a windlass made of a heavy marker in her hand before Reyes had the cart open, and she dropped to her knees in the spreading dark and bound it high and hard around the young woman's thigh above the burn and twisted the windlass down with a strength that does not look like much until you see it stop ephemeral bleed. Hard enough that the young woman cried out, and the glistening pump of red from the legs stopped, simply stopped, in the time it took Reyes to turn around with an unopened package in his hand. "Mark the time on her. She's a red, she goes to bay too," Donna said to him, flat and even, not unkind, arterial thigh, the tourniquet's tight. Do not loosen it for anyone. Go. And Reyes, who outranked her on paper and had a famous surgeon's example fresh in his mind, looked at the stopped bleeding and the woman who had done in seconds what he had been 3 minutes from doing, and some part of his borrowed certainty cracked clean across, and he did the smartest thing he would do all night. He stopped arguing with the universe about what was supposed to be happening, and he did what she said. That was the hinge of it, the moment the night turned, though no one had time to notice it as it happened. Because Reyes moved, and the moving worked, and the woman lived, the rest of them began, one by one, to orient on the only fixed point in the room, the calm woman in teal scrubs kneeling in the blood who clearly, unmistakably, knew exactly what she was doing. Dana did not ask for command. Command simply flowed to the competents, the way water finds the low ground, and she took it without a flicker of hesitation. Because she had held it before in far worse places. She came up off her knees and sent Tully, pulled gently but firmly off the one coughing man she had been tending, and made to scrub her contaminated hands first. To run the red zone with a 2-sentence briefing that was worth more than a year of lectures. Stop the bleeding you can see, open the airways that are closed, get oxygen on the ones who are choking, and do nothing else, do not assess, do not chart. Just keep them alive until we can come back. And then she turned to Ashford. This was the part that took a particular kind of nerve, because Ashford was one of the finest surgeons in the region, standing in the middle of her waiting room with his expertise turned to water, and a lesser person who needed the credit might have left him to flounder, might have taken a quiet satisfaction in the famous man's helplessness. Dana did the opposite. She walked up to him and spoke low and fast and level, not as a nurse to a doctor, and not as a rescuer to a man who was drowning, but as one professional handing another the one job that would save him, and she said, "Doctor, I need you to stop trying to run this floor, because you've never run one like this, and it'll eat you alive. And I have. What I need from you is the thing nobody else in this building can do. I need you in the back. In the 2 beds we can turn into a surgical space, doing the deep saves, the airways that won't open any other way, the chests, the bellies, the ones that need real hands, and I will feed you exactly the patients who need exactly that, one at a time, so you never have to choose. You do what you're the best in the world at, and let me do what I'm good at, and between us we keep more of these people than anybody has a right to. Can you do that?" And Ashford, his face a war between affront and the dawning animal understanding that he was lost and she was not, looked at this clinic nurse he had mocked the evening before, and something in him, some deep surgeon's honesty that had survived under all the pride, recognized the truth of every word, and he said, "Yes, yes, I can do that. Feed me." And he went. And then Dana Holloway stood at the center of her overwhelmed little hospital, in the spreading noise of the worst night of its history, and she did the things she had been built for in the years no one here knew about. She ran the triage. She walked the growing rows of the wounded at a pace that looked almost unhurried and was in fact ruthlessly fast, and she sorted them, laying a hand on each, reading each in the 2 or 3 seconds each one could be given, and she spoke a single color over each that sent them flowing to the right place, red for the ones who would die without immediate intervention, but could be saved. The arterial bleeds and the closing airways and the chests that could not move air, yellow for the serious but stable, the broken bones and the deep burns that could wait their turn, green for the walking wounded already rinsed and moved to the far end of the lot, and twice in that first hour, with a stillness in her that the staff would never forget and never quite forgive the necessity of. The quiet word that meant there was nothing to be done, the patients too far gone to save with what they had on a spit of land with one surgeon and no flight coming, and a second tank threatening to blow, who could only be made comfortable and not alone, while the ones who could be saved were saved first. She did not flinch from those two. That was the cost she had paid for long ago, and carried in the coin on her lanyard the terrible knowledge that triage is not about saving everyone, because everyone cannot be saved. It is about saving the most, and that the person willing to make that arithmetic out loud, in the open, while everyone else looks away from it, is the most important and the loneliest person in the room. The second wave hit at 1 minutes past 6, and it was worse than the first, because the first had been the walking and the lightly burned who could get themselves out, and the second was what the harbor's volunteer crews and the first ambulance dragged in off the dock itself, the ones who could not walk, the men and women caught close to the tank when it went, and they came through the bay doors on backboards and in the arms of soot-blackened strangers, with a thing layered over every single injury that Dana had been bracing for since the floor first jumped, which was the breathing. That was the part this fire added that an ordinary trauma would not have, the part Ashford had not even thought to be afraid of yet. Every one of them had breathed superheated air and chemical smoke, and the damage was inside them where no one could see it, their airways swelling shut by the minute, their lungs filling, and Dana knew that on this harbor the smoke would try to kill as many of them as the blast had, and that the cruelest trick of an inhalation injury is that the patient can look almost fine for 20 minutes, and then close off entirely and die, so that the calm-looking man you set aside is the one you find blue in the corner. She had seen exactly that, in a steel compartment far out at sea, and she folded that knowledge into her sorting without breaking stride, adding a question to the ones she asked of every body she knelt over. Not just are they bleeding and are they burned and is their heart holding, but listen to the breath. Is there soot at the nose and mouth? Is the voice going hoarse? Are the hairs of the nose singed? Because every one of those was a clock ticking down to an airway that would slam shut, and the ones with the clock running had to have their airways secured now, while it could still be done, and not in 20 minutes when it could not. She met the first backboard at the doors beside the decon line and read the patient in a glance, a young man, his chest crushed against something in the blast, struggling for each breath, his neck veins standing out like cords, his lips the dusky blue that was half the smoke and half the thing happening inside him, and she knew this one cold, a tension building in the chest cavity that would kill him in another minute or two, and she knew the fix for it lived in this little hospital, behind a wall of permissions and a procedure tray nobody had time to find. She did not hesitate. She called for Ashford as she moved, "I need you," now tension pneumo, Bay 1, and she had the young man's coat cut open and her fingers counting down his ribs by the time Ashford came through from the back. And what happened next was the first moment the visiting surgeon truly saw her, because she did not hand him a frightened patient and a problem. She handed him a patient already prepped. The landmark found, her finger pressed on the exact spot, and she said, fast and flat, the precise place and depth, the way a scrub nurse, who has done it 1,000 times, feeds a surgeon, and Ashford, running on pure instinct now, did the decompression, and the trapped air hissed out and the young man's chest filled, and his color came back from the dead gray edge. and Ashford looked up at the clinic nurse with an expression that had no name, because the thing he was beginning to feel did not fit anywhere in the file he had built on her. "Where did you learn that?" he said. Not a challenge now, a real question, almost lost in the noise. And Dana was already turning to the next backboard, and she said over her shoulder, later, "Get him to the back and listen to his lungs. He's been in the smoke." And she was gone into the flood, and Ashford stood for 1/2 second looking after her before the next dying patient pulled him back under, and the question stayed in him. A small stone dropped into a deep well, falling. It went on like that for what the clock would later say was a little under 3 hours, and what felt, to everyone inside it, like both a single held breath and an entire season. And the building, which had been built and stocked for a quiet harbor where the worst Thursday brought a crushed hand, began, one supply at a time, to run dry, and she did not panic when the shelves emptied, because she had simply never expected them to be full. They ran out of the manufactured burn dressings within the first half hour, and Dana, without breaking stride, began improvising the way she had in a place that had no shelves at all, clean dry sheeting and plastic wrap off the supply roll to cover the burns and hold the moisture and the warmth in and the air off the raw skin, which is most of what a burn dressing does anyway. And she pulled 2 steady volunteers out of the green line, a dock worker with calm hands and a ferry deckhand who had walked in with a scorched forearm and refused to sit down, and taught each of them in 15 seconds how to cover a burn and how to hold pressure and when to call her. When the commercial oxygen masks ran short, and they ran short fast because half her patients needed oxygen at once, she set up a system she had run before in a compartment with too few outlets, prioritizing the high-flow oxygen to the inhalation patients whose lungs were failing and rigging the rest to share, because oxygen was a treatment here as surely as any drug, and she knew, the way the others did not, that a burned patient who is also choking on smoke cannot be saved by dressing the burn alone, that you fight both fires at once or lose them to the one you forgot. The blood bank, a single small refrigerator with a modest store, could not begin to keep up, and Dana ran the cooler herself, allocating the units not to the ones who needed them most, which is what an untrained heart does, but to the ones the blood would actually save, which is not always the same patient. And then, in the second hour, the thing she had half expected from the moment the tank went up finally happened. The fire reached a transformer on the terminal side, and the power to the whole spit of land stuttered and dropped, for 3 long seconds, into pitch black. Before the old generator coughed and caught and brought them up to the dim red half-light of emergency power, half the outlets dead, the bright modern hospital reduced in an instant to a dim cave full of the dying. And in those 3 seconds of total dark, while everyone else froze and someone screamed, Dana Holloway did not so much as pause, because she had done all of this in the dark before, had managed airways by feel in a blacked-out compartment with the ship heeling under her and the emergency lights swinging, and her voice simply came through the blackness, steady and unhurried, telling the room to hold still and breathe, telling Marcus to break out the headlamps and battery lanterns from the disaster cart she had stalked herself against the very day an administrator would write her up for it, and when the dim light came up, the staff found her exactly where her voice had been, kneeling over a patient with her hands already working, a fixed point you could navigate by, the way frightened people in the dark navigate by the one voice that is not afraid. The world, of course, did not stop sending its ordinary emergencies just because a tank had blown on the waterfront, and somewhere in the second hour the test got harder in a way no protocol accounts for. A car came slewing into the lot, nothing to do with the fire, just the random cruelty of timing, and a man half carried his wife through the decon line and into the dim red department. A woman in her 60s whose face had gone slack down one side and whose words had turned to a slurred ruin, a stroke in full progress, arriving into the middle of a disaster that had already consumed every resource the building had. The husband was frantic, shouting that his wife was dying, and he was right. On any ordinary Thursday, 4 people would have descended on her at once. But this was not an ordinary Thursday, and Dana had to hold in 3 seconds the two truths that do not want to be held together: that this woman's life mattered exactly as much as every burned body on her floor, and that the building did not have enough hands to give her everything she needed without letting someone else die in the next bed. She did not freeze, and she did not lie. She got the woman onto the one free monitor, noted the time the trouble had started, did the few fast things that could be done, and folded her into the flow as a case that would have to wait its turn. And she did it so cleanly that neither the woman nor her husband ever understood how thin the margin had been. And the husband she handled the way she had handled 100 frantic relatives at the edges of catastrophes all over the world, not by ordering him away, which never works, but by giving him a job, telling him his wife needed him to hold her good hand and keep talking to her, low and calm, keep her warm and keep her from being frightened, and the man drowning in his helplessness seized the job the way a drowning man seizes a rope, and sat and stopped being a danger and started being a comfort. And the small chaos he had been making simply dissolved into the larger order she was building. And the staff changed as the night ground on, the way people always change under someone who knows what they are doing. The fear that had doubled when Ashford's voice climbed had been replaced, gradually, by something Dana had watched take hold before in desperate places: a grim, competent calm that flows downhill from a calm commander, and the bright young clinicians who had frozen 90 minutes earlier were now moving with a hard new purpose, doing more and better work than they had ever done in their lives, because she had freed them from the impossible weight of deciding everything and given them each one clear job and the steadying knowledge that someone above them was holding the whole. Reyes ran the surgical feed she had built him, ferrying the deep saves to Ashford one at a time. Tully ran her red zone and did not once drift back to giving one stable patient her whole attention, because she had learned in a single night to move past the loud to reach the silent. And the three of them, who had spent the evening thinking of Dana as the quiet woman who handed out forms, understood now, without anyone saying it, that they had been working alongside someone they had never once actually seen. There was a fresh wave of friction in the middle of all this, the kind that always comes when more than one authority arrives at a disaster, in the shape of a harbor police sergeant who had fought his way to the hospital against the tide of fleeing cars, a big, competent man with the habit of command worn into him, who came through meaning to take control of the scene the way he took control of every scene, asking loudly where the doctor was and that nobody was to move patients without his say. And Dana, without stopping the thing her hands were doing, met his eye and spoke to him in a voice that he, of all people, recognized at once, the flat-level certainty of someone who has run worse than this, and she said, "Sergeant, I'm running it and I need you out there. Not in this room. There's a second tank smoking next door and a bridge jammed solid with people who can't get out. Get me a clear lane from the dock to my bay so the crews can keep bringing me the wounded, and the second that fire's knocked down enough to fly, I need a clear spot in that lot for a helicopter. That's the job that saves the most people right now, and you're the only one who can do it." And the sergeant, who knew that voice in his bones because it was the voice he used on his own worst nights, said, "Yes, ma'am," and went back out into the smoke to do exactly what she had asked. Roland Pace arrived a little after that. He had been called, the way administrators are called when a disaster becomes a thing that will have to be explained later, and he had driven up the coast against the outbound traffic in his good wool suit and his city shoes, carrying nothing useful, and he stopped, as everyone stopped, at the sheer overwhelming sight of it, the smoke-hazed corridors, the improvised tourniquets twisted onto leg after leg, the burns wrapped in plastic and clean sheeting, the dim red emergency light, the patients on oxygen in every bed and on the floor between them, the controlled, desperate motion of a 6-bed hospital that had taken 100 casualty catastrophe and was, against every reasonable expectation, holding. And then his eyes found the center of it, and he saw, to his visible confusion, that the person directing his department, the person every clinician and volunteer was orienting on and obeying, the person the harbor police sergeant had just taken an order from and gone back out to follow, was the clinic charge nurse he had written up 2 days before for operating outside her scope, the one with the unauthorized drills and the gauge not approved by the supply committee. For a moment, the disaster and the chain of command collided in his mind, and the chain of command won, because it always had, because the columns were the whole of his religion, and he crossed the floor to her with a tight official expression and said, in the low, controlled voice of a man already thinking about liability, Dana, Dana, you can't be running clinical operations. This has to be physician-led. Where is Dr. Ashford? You are not authorized to make these. And he got that far before something happened that he did not expect. Ashford cut him off. Ashford, who had spent the first evening agreeing with every unspoken judgment Roland Pace had ever made about the clinic nurse, who had mocked her gauge and called her a quaint local fixture, looked up from the back where he was elbow deep in keeping a man alive, his borrowed gown soaked through, his pride long since burned away and replaced by something cleaner and harder. And he said, loud enough to carry over the whole room, she is authorized. I'm authorizing her. She has command of this floor and has had it since the doors opened, and she is the only reason any of these people are still breathing. Anybody who has a problem with that can take it up with me in writing when we are not drowning. And he went back to his patient, and Roland Pace stood there with his scope of practice memo somewhere in a drawer 200 miles away, in a room that had just, with 2 sentences from the most credentialed man in the building, rendered all of it meaningless. And for the first time in the entire story, he had nothing to say, because the numbers he ran the world by had no column for what was happening in front of him. And somewhere underneath the affront, a far more uncomfortable feeling was beginning to stir, which was the dawning suspicion that he had spent the better part of a year quietly building a file on the single most valuable person in his entire network. The question everyone in the building had begun, without quite knowing it, to ask, got spoken out loud at last by one of the volunteer ambulance crew. A grizzled old hand named Boggs, who had pulled people off this harbor for 30 years. He came in with another backboard and stopped on his way back out into the smoke and watched Dana seal a sucking chest wound and reduce a dislocated shoulder and call a color over a 3rd patient in the time it took him to set his stretcher down, and he said to Marcus, not quite quietly enough, "Who is she? Where does a clinic charge nurse learn to run a mass cast like that? I've worked wrecks and fires on this water for 30 years, and I've seen maybe 2 people move the way she's moving, and they weren't clinic nurses. They were." And he stopped because Dana had glanced at him just once, a flat, steady look, and he was a man who knew that look, had seen it on the faces of the 2 people he'd been about to name, and he understood that he had wandered up to the edge of something she did not talk about, and he closed his mouth and gave her a small nod and went back out into the haze. But the question hung in the air now, where the whole room could feel it. How does a clinic nurse know how to do that? And the building, working all around her, began to wait for the answer the way you wait for a held note to finally resolve. The trapped man came in just after that, and he was the one who would, without ever meaning to, pull the whole truth out into the light. The fire crews and the yard's own people had been cutting men out of the wreckage of the pump house for an hour. And the worst of them came late, and this one came in still partly attached to a section of the steel he had been working beside when the tank went. A young man in his late 20s in scorched coveralls, his arm crushed beneath a folded slab of buckled pipe that the crews had cut away from the rest of the wreck with him still in it because they could not free the arm at the scene without losing him to the bleeding. He was pale and shocky and gray with blood loss, his arm a ruin, and he was conscious and he was terrified, and the problem he presented was the single hardest of the whole night, because the crushed and trapped limb was at once the only thing keeping him from bleeding to death and the thing that was poisoning his blood and would stop his heart the moment the weight came off. A vise with no good way out of it, the grim, impossible field problem that Dana Holloway had faced in her whole life exactly once before, in a steel compartment far out on the water, on the night that had given her the coin. She knelt by the trapped young man and did not let her face show any of it. The recognition, the old grief that rose up in her like cold seawater filling a flooded compartment, and she took his cold hand in hers, and told him her name, which she almost never did, and told him he was going to feel her do things that hurt, and that every one of them was a thing that would get him home. And she went to work. And while her hands did the work, fast and exact, setting the lines, pushing the warmed fluids, getting ahead of the flood of poison that would surge through his system the instant the weight lifted off the arm, getting the calcium and the bicarbonate and the blood ready for the heart she knew would stop if she got the sequence even slightly wrong. The part of her mind that was not needed for the work went, the way it always did, to Eddie. Eddie Vance had been her chief and her teacher across the last 4 of her years at sea, a big, calm, unhurried man a decade older than her, a senior corpsman who had taught her almost everything she knew that no book had ever held. And the two of them had kept the dying alive in that steel room 100 times, each more than once holding the other's nerve together when the deck pitched and the casualties came down the ladder faster than there were hands. It was Eddie who had taught her to move past the loud to reach the silent, that the calm is a gift you give the people around you, and you get to choose which one you spread through a room. It was Eddie who, on the night a fire tore through a forward compartment and the trapped sailors were pinned exactly the way this young yard worker was pinned now, the same viz., the same impossible arithmetic, had crawled into the wreckage beside her and done with her the slow, terrible sequence thing that brings a crushed man back from the dead the moment the weight comes off, and the man had lived, and the two of them had come out into a gray dawn on a scorched deck, filthy and shaking and alive, and Eddie had pressed a small, dull challenge coin into her hand, one of his own, worn smooth, and told her to keep it, that people who do what they had just done do not get parades, they get to go home, and the coin is so you remember the ones who did not. And he had unclipped the brass diver's gauge from his own old kit, the one he had carried since his diving days, and pressed that into her hand too, and told her that on the worst nights, when the smoke and the dying had her so turned around that she did not know which way was up, the gauge would always know, that it would always tell her the truth about where she was and how much she had left, and all she ever had to do was trust the needle and take the next breath, and then the next one, and that was the whole of it. That was how you got back to the surface alive. 9 months after that, on an ordinary transit on an ordinary gray morning, in the stupid random way the world takes its best people, Eddie Vance had not gotten to go home. And Dana had carried the coin and the gauge every single day since. Through the leaving of the sea and the long, quiet years on the harbor, a man's whole legacy worn smooth against her chest. And she had never once told a soul at the hospital that the trinket the surgeon mocked and the administrator wrote her up for was the only grave she had. He had left her a letter, too. She had not been there when he died, and afterward someone had handed her an envelope with her name on it in his blunt, careful hand, the kind of letter the people in that work sometimes write and leave with their things against the day the random morning comes, and she had carried that folded letter in the inside pocket of every jacket she had owned since. Soft now, and worn nearly through at the creases, and she had read it so many times that she did not need to unfold it to hear it. It was short. It was not sentimental, because he had not been. It said that if she was reading it, then it had happened, and that she was not to carry it, the weight of the ones they could not save, because she had carried more than her share and saved more lives than anyone would ever write down. It said that the work was never the parades, that the work was the next person, always and only the next person, the one in front of you right now who could still be saved. And it ended with the line she heard now, kneeling on the floor of her own little hospital with her hands inside the worst night of a stranger's life, the line about the gauge, that the needle always tells you the truth about where you are, even when you have lost all sense of it, that all you ever have to do is trust it and take the next breath and reach for the next one who can still be saved. And then the one after that, and that is the whole of it, that is how you carry it, one necessary thing at a time until you break the surface and the sun is there. She breathed out. She did the next necessary thing. And then the one after that, she got him out. When the word came that the crews had finally cut the slab of pipe free enough to lift it clear, she had the young man so completely prepared, every line running, every drug drawn up in order on the tray beside her knee, the improvised tourniquet she had, wound high on the arm, ready to be cinched the instant the weight came off, that when the steel finally rose and the ruined arm came free, and his heart did exactly what she had known for an hour it would do, and stopped. She was already pushing the calcium and the bicarb, and calling the compressions in the same flat, calm voice, and a minute and a half later, while a young volunteer wept with a relief he could not yet afford, the young man's heart stuttered and caught and held, and he was alive, and he would stay alive, because the woman the network had decided was just a clinic nurse, had once crawled into a burning compartment far out at sea beside a man who was gone now and learned, in the worst place on earth, the exact and terrible sequence that brings this one back. Not everyone came back. That has to be said, because the story would be a lie without it. There was a man in the red zone, perhaps 50, whose bleeding they had controlled in the first hour and whose color had been climbing back toward life, and who crashed without warning in the third hour from a blast injury hidden deep inside him that no one could have seen in time. Not with one tired old imaging machine, and no surgeon to spare, and no flight in the air. And Dana was at his side within seconds and ran the code herself, hard and expert and complete, every right thing in the right order for the better part of 40 minutes, far longer than she should have, and the man died anyway, past the reach of any hands on earth. And for just one moment, when she finally called it and said the time of death in the flat, steady voice and stepped back from the bed, the staff saw the true cost of what she was, saw it cross her face and go quiet behind her eyes, the particular private grief of the person who carries the arithmetic for everyone else. And then they saw her do the single hardest thing any of them had ever watched a human being do, which was to set it down deliberately the way you set down a tool you cannot use right now and turn and walk to the next patient, because the next patient could still be saved and the man on the bed could not. She did the next necessary thing. The young volunteer who had wept earlier watched her do it and understood at last what the job actually was and what it cost, and what it meant that this woman had been doing it quietly at their front desk for 7 years while the harbor called her the burned-out small-town lifer. By the 4th hour the wave had crested. The fire crews had finally knocked the tank fire down and cooled the second tank enough that it was no longer going to go. The dock had given up the last of its wounded. The volunteer trucks were coming back empty now, and the great choking flood of the burned and the broken had become gradually a finite number of human beings sorted and stabilized and being worked methodically by a building that had been turned in the space of a single evening from a frightened handful of people into one of the finest disaster response teams that had ever existed inside those walls, and the thing that had turned it stood at the center of the dim red room in teal scrubs gone black with smoke and other people's blood, still steady, still calling the next necessary thing. The count, when they finally had time to make it, was almost impossible to believe. 119 patients through the doors of a 6-bed hospital in a little under 4 hours, the kind of surge that closes departments 10 times the size. And in this one, which should by every reasonable expectation have been buried into chaos and loss, the survival numbers were going to come out, when the long reviews were finally done, almost impossibly good. Good in a way the experts who studied it afterward would struggle to explain without using the word the hospital's own records did not contain, which was that on the night the terminal blew on the waterfront, this little building had, by pure accident, been run by one of the finest mass casualty nurses alive. And then, a little before midnight, the harbor went quiet enough to hear the water again, and into the new stillness, faint at first and then growing, came a sound that Dana Holloway heard before anyone else in the building did. Because it was a sound her body had been built around for 11 years, the deep rhythmic beat of rotor blades coming in low over the harbor, an aeromedical helicopter finally able to fly now that the fire was down, coming for the criticals at last. The sergeant had kept the lane clear and the lot cleared exactly as she had asked, and the aircraft came down out of the dark onto the cleared ground at the edge of the lot, its light sweeping the smoke still hanging over the water, and the doors slid open, and a flight crew came across the lot toward the little hospital, moving with the particular economical urgency of people who do this for a living. The man who came through the doors first and stopped was the senior of them, a fleet medical officer, riding the bird to coordinate the criticals out, a weather-beaten man in his 50s, gray at the temples, calm in the specific bone-deep way that only people who have done this kind of work for 30 years are calm, and he came in out of the smoke smelling dark and stopped. As everyone that night had stopped, at the sheer overwhelming sight of it, the smoke-hazed corridors, the color-coded zones still holding clean in the dim light, the 119 lives sorted and stabilized and waiting, the burns wrapped a particular correct way, the decon lines still running clean at the seaward doors, the order under the exhaustion. And he stood there with the eye of a man who has seen a great many disaster receptions and knows in an instant the difference between one that was survived and one that was run, and what he saw made his eyebrows go up, because most of them were a mess. And this one, for all the smoke and the blood and the weariness, bore the unmistakable fingerprints of someone who had run it by a doctrine he recognized in his own spine. He saw the casualty flow, the way the inhalation injuries had been pulled forward and their airways taken early, the decontamination done right, the burns managed with field improvisations, the things you only think to do if you have run mass casualties somewhere there are no shelves and the room itself is on fire. And he began, frowning slightly, to look around the room for the person who had to be responsible, expecting some flown-in disaster specialist, and his eye traveled across the dim red room and snagged, and stopped, on a woman in filthy teal scrubs with a brass diver's gauge on a frayed strap around her neck. He went very still. The room, which had been a churn of exhausted motion all night, seemed to the people in it to slow around the two of them, though nothing actually slowed. It only felt that way afterward in the telling. He took a step toward her and another, his eyes moving over her, the way a man's eyes move when he is matching a face in front of him against a face from a long time ago, from another life, from the worst and most important days of his own service. He took in the worn brass gauge on the loop at her chest, the old soft brass and the scratched glass and the small, dull coin clipped beside it, and his weather-beaten face did something complicated, and when he spoke, his voice was not loud, but the room had gone quiet enough by then to hear it. Every clinician and volunteer and the administrator in his good wool suit and the two young staff she had forged into a team, all of them watching this strange, slow recognition unfold without yet understanding it. "I know you," he said. And Dana, who had not stopped working, who had a card in her hand and was already half turning toward the next thing, went still in her turn and looked at him, really looked, and the room watched something cross her own face, recognition answering recognition across a span of years and an ocean. "I know you," the old officer said again, and he came the last few steps to her, and he said a word that no one in that hospital had ever heard. A word that was not Dana and was not Holloway and was not nurse. A call sign, two clipped syllables, the name she had answered to in the steel rooms she did not talk about. And he said it the way you say a name you were sure you would never get to say to its owner again. And Dana Holloway, after a long moment, gave the smallest nod, which was its own kind of answer. "I came up through the same casualty receiving team you trained," the officer said, and now he was speaking half to her and half, without quite meaning to the stunned and silent room, because he was a man who understood instinctively that a wrong was being righted in front of him and that it needed witnesses. "Years after your time. But everybody who came up after you, they taught us the way you ran a casualty deck. They taught the load plan you wrote the night of the forward fire. There was a chief, used to talk about a receiving nurse who ran the worst nights anybody worked, who brought back people nobody had any business bringing back, and who'd lost, and he stopped, because Dana's eyes had moved just once to the gauge on her chest and back, and the officer was a man who knew exactly what that meant, and he let the name of the dead go unsaid, the way you do." He looked around the wrecked little hospital at the controlled aftermath of a surge that should have been a catastrophe, and he understood precisely who had done it, and he looked back at her, and the next thing he did slowly and deliberately and entirely on purpose, in front of all of them. The old fleet officer came to attention, this gray-weathered man who had run 100 disasters and bowed to no one, and he brought his hand up in a slow, precise, unmistakable salute and held it to a clinic-charged nurse in smoke-blackened scrubs in a 6-bed harbor hospital, and said quietly, "Ma'am, it is an honor to finally put a face to that call sign. I have been hearing about you my whole career, and I never thought I'd get to stand in a room you'd run." And the room understood. All at once, the surgeon who had mocked her gauge, and the young clinicians who had deferred past her, and the administrator who had built a file on her, every one of them understood at the same instant exactly who had been standing at their front desk for 7 years, exactly whose hands had been on their patients all night, exactly what the trinket was that the visiting surgeon had laughed at and the policy had forbidden. The woman the network had decided was the least important person in the building was, and had been all along, the most. And not one of them, in that moment, could find a single thing to say. Dana did not enjoy it. That is the part that mattered most about her, and it would have disappointed anyone hoping for a scene of triumph. She did not draw herself up. She did not look at Ashford, or at Roland Pace, or let a single flicker of vindication cross her face. She looked, for a moment, deeply and simply tired, the tiredness of someone who has carried a great weight a very long way and has just had it acknowledged and finds that the acknowledgement does not make the weight 1 ounce lighter, only a little less lonely. And then she did the only thing she knew how to do. She returned the old officer's salute with a small nod, equal to equal, that said more than any speech could have, and turned back to her building, because there were still patients who needed to fly and a long smoke-gray night of it ahead, and she said in the same flat, steady voice she had used all night, "We've got 4 Reds who need to be on that aircraft in the next 20 minutes, worst first. Let's load them right and not lose anybody on the way to the burn center." And the spell broke, and the room came back into motion, and the work went on. But it went on differently now, because everything had changed, and every soul in that building knew it. Ashford found her an hour later, when the criticals were on the aircraft and the building had begun the long, slow exhale of a crisis ending. He looked older than he had the evening before, and humbler in the way men are humbled not by being beaten, but by being shown the true size of something they had been too small to see, and he did not make excuses, which was the one decent thing left for him to do, and he did it. "I was wrong about you," he said. "From the minute I walked in, and I said things, and I want you to know that I know it." He stopped, and then he said the thing that cost him the most. "When it started, I froze. I had no idea what to do, and you knew exactly what to do, and you ran my floor and saved my patients and handed me the one job I could still be good at, and you never once made me feel it. I've been doing this 26 years, and I have never seen anything like what you did tonight." And Dana looked at him, and there was no cruelty in her, none at all, and she said, simply, "You did good work tonight, once you had room to. That decompression saved that kid, and the chest you opened saved another one. You're a fine surgeon, Vincent." And then, because the work was always the only point, she added, quietly, "If you want to thank me, help me make the next one go better. That terminal will catch again in some other year, and the only thing standing between these people and the dark cannot be one tired nurse who happened to be on shift. Let me run my drills on the clock with the staff so the whole harbor knows what to do." And Ashford, who the evening before had offered to show her how to put a depth gauge on her phone, said, "Yes, God, yes, teach all of us. Start with me." Roland Pace never quite apologized. Men like Roland Pace rarely do, because the apology would require them to take apart the entire structure by which they understand their own importance. But something in him had shifted all the same, and it showed in the only language he had. The counseling notice disappeared from her file. No one ever saw him remove it, but it was simply gone, as though it had never been written. The drills were approved a few weeks later as a new network disaster preparedness initiative for the region's coastal sites. written up in his careful institutional language as though it had been his own idea from the start, which Dana let him have without a flicker, because she did not care whose idea the world believed it was, only that the staff would be ready when the terminal burned again. And months later, when the Regional Review held that small, understaffed harbor hospital up as a model of mass casualty response, it was Roland Pace who stood at the front of a bright conference room and accepted the recognition on behalf of the network. And he did not say Dana Holloway's name. And Dana, sitting in the back in her teal scrubs, did not mind, because she had stopped needing her name said out loud a long time ago, in a place where no names were ever said at all. The people who mattered knew. That was enough. It had always been enough. The two young ones were never the same after that night, and that, more than any salute, was the thing Dana would have called the real reward. Reyes, who had frozen with a chart in his hand, became her most relentless student, turning up for every drill, asking the questions she could see cost him his pride, and he would become a genuinely fine clinician, the kind who stays calm when the room comes apart, and he would tell the story, when he taught the ones who came after him, of the night a clinic nurse stepped onto a chair in a burning harbor and stopped a room full of dying people from drowning. And he would always end it the same way, by telling them that the most important person in any room is almost never the one with the most letters after their name. And Tully, who had knelt so carefully over the one coughing man while 3 silent people died along the wall, never again confused thoroughness for judgment, and she became the one with the real gift for triage, the one who could walk into chaos and feel her way straight to the dying, and she had learned it in a single night from the woman who had taught her, the hard way, to move past the loud to reach the silent. The young man with the crushed arm came back. It took months and surgeries and a long, hard road, but he kept the arm, and one afternoon the following autumn, when the harbor had gone gold and cold, he walked back into the little hospital with the arm in a brace and a great deal of stubbornness to find the nurse who had knelt in the wreck of his accident and held his cold hand and told him every hurt was a thing that would get him home. He found her at the front desk, of course, and he did not make a speech, because she was not a woman who would have known what to do with one. He just stood there a moment and then said, "Thank you for not letting go." And Dana, who had held the hands of more frightened people than she could count across half the world, felt something move in her that she did not let show. And she told him to sit down before he fell down and checked the color of his fingers out of pure habit, 2 steady fingers on his wrist, and told him he was healing well, and he was. He asked her before he left where she had learned to do what she did, and this time she gave him a little more of the answer than usual. She told him she had learned it in some hard places out on the water, from some good people, most of whom had not gotten to come home, and that bringing him home had been, in a way he would never fully understand, a way of bringing a small piece of them home, too. He did not press. He was by then someone who understood that some things are carried and not explained, and he went back out into his second life, the one she had given him. Marcus knew the most in the end, and after that night the two of them never once spoke of it directly, but something settled between them that had not needed words before, and needed them even less now. Marcus simply started leaving a second paper cup of coffee on the front desk at the start of every evening shift, the good kind from the place down the pier, the small mundane ritual of one person telling another that they are seen, and Dana drank it, and that was the whole of the conversation, and it was complete. And the cocky traveling nurse who had once called her the burned-out small-town lifer heard the story secondhand and came back through a season later and could not quite meet her eyes and mumbled that he was sorry, that he hadn't known, and Dana told him what she always told the ones who had underestimated her and lived to learn better, that it was all right, that nobody ever knows what anybody else has carried, and that the only thing that matters is what you do the next time you are wrong about someone. It is worth asking, before the story closes, why a person like Dana Holloway chooses the quiet at all, why someone who had run the worst casualty nights at sea would instead take the most invisible job on a working harbor and let a man like Roland Pace build a file on her for a year without once setting him straight. The easy answer, the wrong one, is that she was broken, that the years at sea had hollowed her out, and the front desk was where the hollow people go to hide. But that was not it, and Marcus, who watched her closest, knew it was not it. Dana had spent 11 years where every day might be the worst day of someone's life, and she had learned out there exactly what she was capable of and exactly what it cost. And she had decided. When she came ashore for good with Eddie's coin in her pocket and his letter folded over her heart, that she did not need the world to keep telling her she was extraordinary. She knew what she was. She had nothing left to prove to anyone, which is the rarest and most dangerous kind of freedom a person can have, because it cannot be taken and it cannot be bought, and it makes you serenely unbothered by the Ashfords and the Paces of the world, who run on exactly the opposite fuel, on the endless need to be told that they matter. She had chosen the front desk because the work was honest and the need was real, and every shift somebody frightened and hurting came in off the harbor, and she got to be the steady hand that met them, and that to her was not one step down from the worst nights at sea. It was those nights, distilled to their purest form, the next necessary thing, one person at a time, no parades, no podium, just the work and the deep, quiet satisfaction of being exactly where she was needed, unseen and entirely herself. There is a thing the people who run the world by titles never understand about the people who run it by competence, and it should be said plainly before the end. The titled believe recognition is the point, that the salute and the plaque and the name said out loud are the reward the work is paid in, and so they cannot comprehend a person who does the work without needing the pay, and they mistake that person's silence for the silence of someone with nothing to say, when it is in fact the silence of someone who already holds everything that matters. The systems we build to sort the important from the unimportant, the letters after the name, the title on the coat, the equipment approved by the supply committee, are useful most of the time on the ordinary Thursdays when the patients come in one at a time. But they are only a map of the truth, and like every map, they are wrong in exactly the places that matter most. And the night the tank blows on the waterfront, the night the wave arrives that the systems were never built to hold, the map fails, and all that is left is the territory. And in the territory, the only thing that has ever mattered is whether the person in front of you knows what to do, whether they will keep their head when everyone else loses theirs, whether they will move past the loud to reach the silent and make the terrible arithmetic out loud and hold the line until the sun comes up over the water. Titles cannot do that. Only people can do that. And the people who can are almost never the people the room has decided to look at. A few weeks after the night of the fire, on an ordinary evening before an ordinary shift, Dana Holloway sat alone for a while in the quiet of the empty break room as the last of the day's cold gold light came slanting low off the harbor through the window and lay across the table. She had a soft cloth in her hands and the worn brass diver's gauge on the table in front of her. Off her lanyard for once, and she was cleaning it slowly, the way she did every so often, working the cloth into the seam of the case and along the strap gone soft and pale from 18 years of long days, and beside it on the table sat the small, dull challenge coin, and beside that, unfolded, soft and worn nearly through at the creases, sat the letter. She did not need to read it. She knew every word of it by heart. But she read it anyway, the way you visit a grave, the blunt, careful handwriting of a big, calm, unhurried man who had taught her to move past the loud to reach the silent and had not, himself, gotten to go home. The work was the next person, always and only the next person. The needle always tells you the truth about where you are. Even when you have lost all sense of it, trust it and take the next breath and reach for the next one who can still be saved, and then the one after that. And that is the whole of it. That is how you carry it, one necessary thing at a time until you break the surface and the sun is there. She sat with it as the gold light faded toward dusk, 42 years old. 18 of those years spent with her hands inside other people's worst days, and she let herself feel for a few minutes the full weight of all of it, Eddie and the coin and the burning compartment and the tank on the waterfront and the man in the red zone she had not been able to save, and the young worker with the braced arm who had walked back in to say thank you for not letting go. And then, the way she had learned to, she set it down. She folded the letter along its soft creases and slid it back into the inside pocket over her heart and picked up the small dull coin and turned it over once and clipped it back onto the faded webbing strap. And then she picked up the worn brass diver's gauge, the dive toy, the little gadget she did not need, the only grave she had, and clipped it back onto the strap beside the coin where it belonged, and watched the needle settle, the way it always did, the way it always would, telling her the simple, steady truth about where she was. And she snapped the lanyard straight and squared her shoulders and stood up, because it was almost time to open the board. And somewhere out beyond the tall glass doors, the ordinary evening of a small harbor town was already coming in, the crushed hands and the turned ankles, and the old men who had ignored their chest pains since lunch, the gentle catalog of human trouble, and on almost every night, that was all it would ever be. But she would carry the gauge anyway. She would always carry the gauge, because the day she stopped carrying it would be the day she needed it, and because somewhere a man had once told her that people who do what she did do not get parades, they get to go home. And going home, for Dana Holloway, had always meant going back to the desk at the front of the little building where the frightened people came in off the water and being the calm in the room, unseen and steady and ready for the next one and the one after that. So here is what I will leave you with, the question I have been turning over since I first heard this story. The next time you are in a room full of credentials and confidence, full of the people the world has lifted up and the systems everyone has been taught to trust, and something begins quietly to go wrong, who are you going to be? Are you going to be one of the ones who keeps trusting the title and the protocol and the loudest voice in the room, right up until the moment all of it fails at once? Or are you going to be the one who looks for the quiet, competent soul at the edge of it, the steady pair of hands everyone else has written off, and asks her what she sees and learns? The way a whole building full of certain people learned on the night a tank blew on the waterfront that the most important person in the room is almost never the one the room has decided it is. Competence does not announce itself, and the quietest hands in the building are so often the ones holding it up. That was tonight's story from Unspoken Valor. Some heroes never ask to be seen, but they're always worth the salute.